Welcome to The Details with Adam Froer and Cecil Walker. This is a podcast where we examine the intersection between solution-focused brief therapy and the current topics happening in the world. And we do this because we genuinely want the world to be a better place. So enjoy and come examine the details with us. So, Cecil, we've made it to the end of 2022. A whole year has gone by. This will be our final episode of the season. I guess it kind of feels like we should say congratulations to everyone who's made it this far. What's significant about this particular moment, about reaching the end of an entire calendar year? What lessons should we learn from this particular moment in time?
Oh, I think it's the same type of moment whenever you get to a significant point after accomplishing something. So we've accomplished this year of 2022, but there's lots of other, I think, kind of comparable moments of accomplishment, like finishing a degree, or I ran track a bit in high school. When you finish a big event, you kind of like look back at that, or even when you're just kind of doing running on your own. I know you run every morning. You kind of look back and see the miles that you did, and you kind of feel good about how far you've come and what you've accomplished. And I don't know about you, but after I've had a long run, a good run, if it felt really good and I was happy with my pace, or I was happy with the distance that I did, I start to think, well, what did I eat today? Or, what made me feel so good? Why was I able to push myself so far and get so much done? What put me in the place that I was in to be able to do as well as I did and feel as good as I did? And I think that's something we all could do, not only at these moments of accomplishment, like when you finish something big, but also at the end of the year, at the, these temporal markings, and make it through a chunk of time, and just to stop and look back and say, here are the things that I felt really good about. Why did I feel so good about those? What did I do? What happened? Who was around? How did I know that things were working so well? And I think these are the moments that are good for that, when you're kind of crossing a line like we are into 2023.
Yeah, I think as you were talking, a couple of things came back to my memory. I remember going to, as a university professor, I went to a large number of graduations, and oftentimes graduation turned into something that we just had to survive, right? That it was like, it's long and it's dull and you don't hear anything that like captivates your attention. And so when something did catch your attention, it really stood out because of kind of deviated from the doldrum a bit. And I don't say that to minimize the accomplishments of people at graduation, but the actual ceremonies are not known for excitement.
Yeah, no, I would have skipped my own, actually. Oh, wait, no, I did skip my own.
You did.
Grad school, yeah.
And I think, so I remember one particular graduation speech that stood out, which again is like, this is something significant. And one of the things that he talked about, the speaker talked about, was, this is a moment where you pause. And oftentimes we think of graduations as the exclamation point, the end of something. And he said, in some sense, this is actually the beginning of something. And I think if you think about it, if you think about graduation or the moment of celebration as the beginning of something, then you look back and you say, in essence, what did it take? What preparation have I done in order to get to this moment of starting something? A lot of people, at that moment are starting new jobs, or they're going to live in new places, or they say to themselves, okay, now that this chapter of my life is done, we can start a family, and so they're kind of holding on to this moment as a hinge to all the things that could come. And I think if we take that beginning perspective, then all of the work that we did, in this case, in 2022, that's preparation. That's put us at a place where we're starting 2023 from a different place than we started 2022. And I think in some sense, it's worthwhile to look back and to say, what worked? What successes did I have? How much effort did I need to put in? What did I overcome? And what did all of that do to prepare me for this particular moment in time? And so I think what's really fascinating is that this simultaneous event can be an ending and also a beginning, which actually reminded me of something that Evan George used to talk about. And he would talk about the description that we have of someone's desired outcome. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes, when you look at the evolution of solution-focused brief therapy, they would say things like, we begin with the end in mind. And by asking, what are your best hopes? They would also kind of think about or talk about it as like, let's start with where you want to end up as a starting point, and then we'll work our way there. And one of the things that Evan started saying is, it's not necessarily the end that we are describing, but it's the beginning that we're describing. It's when you leave here and all of this has happened, what will you notice that's different, and who will notice all of that difference? And so again, this simultaneous thing that we think of as the end really is the beginning of what's to come. And I think that if we take this moment in time to reflect on 2022, it might do us some good to say, how did all of this prepare us for 2023?
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating, this take of looking at the end of something as really the beginning of something else. And then, I mean, what you're describing is kind of infusing it, finding the version of you want to step into that new thing by piecing together the things that worked so well from these past versions of you, which kind of makes a continuous transformation from this ending to the next beginning in whatever ways is desirable to you. That makes me think of, I wish I could remember the name for the phenomenon, but there is this very observable phenomenon where people tend to make big changes at important, like temporal markings, like at the beginning of a new week or at their birthday. You know, I'm finally turning 40 or something. And so here's the here's the moment where I'm going to start working out now, or I'm going to learn a new language or something, start traveling. Obviously, people do New Year's resolutions. Here's the point where I'm going to, finally consistently do that thing I keep saying I was going to do. I'm going to start writing more. I'm going to start reading more. I'm going to go to the gym consistently. People make these big changes at these points where it feels like time has refreshed a bit. It's Monday, or it's a new month, it's a new year. And for some reason that seems to work. That just, in everyone's brain, that's just a thing. I can start a new diet on Monday, but trying to start a diet on Thursday randomly doesn't seem to fit. I won't stick with that. My heart won't be in it. It won't work as well. And the reason for that, I believe, is just that we can become more convinced of being a new person, being a new version of ourselves, because time has passed. Last week me is different than current week me. 2023 me is different than 2022 me. And even though the change between December 31st and January 1st is the same as the change between April 9th and April 10th, we still feel like there is this stepping into a new version of ourselves that happens. And I think it's just the belief in, I could be a new version of myself now. The other version of me has passed. And that belief, that mindset, makes things happen for people, makes them change. Making those changes stick might be a different story, and maybe we'll talk about that in January 15th when everyone's gym membership is starting to collect dust. But to initiate that change and to begin to try to step into a new person, a new version of yourself, it seems like that happens at moments where we can really be convinced we can be a new version of ourselves.
Yeah, that actually brought up something I think that's also really consistent with solution-focused therapy, is this foundation of hope. Mm-hmm. I think that when kind of at those markers, right, the beginning of a new week or the beginning of a month, or in this case, the beginning of a year, there's hope. And I think it's not just like unfounded hope, but it's hope that something could be different, that change is possible. If we take a moment right at the end of an era like this and we think, okay, where was I at the beginning of this year? You can see moments of difference. And I think that engenders hope. And then you say, so then how do I build on this hope? If I've moved from A to C, how do I then take change from C to maybe F or whatever it is? And I think about my own life at the beginning of the year. You mentioned that I've been running. I hadn't ever run for a whole consecutive year. And so I didn't know how far I could run in a particular year. And so I just chose an arbitrary number and I said, I think I'm going to run this far this year. And I had no idea if that was feasible or not feasible. And then each week I would keep track of how far I had run and I would take it away from the total of that time. And I actually hit that target in June. And so at this point, I have now run double what I thought was possible at the beginning of the year. And I think there's power in keeping track like that in some way and saying, at the beginning of 2022, I thought I was capable of running a certain amount of miles. And it seemed like a stretch to me because I'd never kept track before. And now I get to the end of 2022 and I think, man, I'm twice as capable as I thought that I was at the beginning of the year. I think it's moments like that that then I look to the next year and I say, so I now believe I'm at least capable of this much. What if I pushed it and I tried to go farther? And I think there's something really valuable in taking note of that and to recognize, man, with just a little bit of effort, I could actually change myself even more. I could become even a more capable version of myself. But that requires, again, taking note and making it in some sense a formal process in some way.
Yeah, I do really like that. I mean, I very much am a believer about being intentional about where we place our attention and using that attention for tracking your progression through something. And just like you're describing, I think has a lot of benefits. Obviously, one of them being that you get to be able to, at some point down the line, say, look at how much I did and look at what it took to accomplish that. Look how much I now know for a fact I'm capable of. But I have a question for you. What if you look back over your you're obviously a very impressive person and lots of people could see what easily stands out to about you as far as your consistency, your dedication to these things. Running is just one of many things that you've been very consistent in. But if someone looked at their own life and saw like, oh, it looks like I didn't do that much in 2022, or actually the goals that I set out at the beginning of 2022, I didn't accomplish, and I would be embarrassed to track or check how much I've done. What does someone do in a predicament like that if they're still trying to walk into 2023 and being uplifted into a certain version of themselves they would be happy to be?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I think there's a couple of things stand out to me. One is, I think, acknowledging any progress, right? If I had set out and I had said, okay, I'm going to run a certain number of miles and I had come drastically short of that. Let's say I'd only run 20% of those miles. I still ran 20% of those miles. And so not taking away the success of saying I could have done none, but I didn't. I did some. So I think then also kind of, again, in this vein of looking backwards, learning the lessons that we learned, looking at what contributed to that 20% of the miles. When did I do it? How did I do it? What made me successful? Were there, for me, one of the things that really got in my way was traveling. It became harder, on days where you're sitting on an airplane all day, you can't run very much. Or I particularly like to run on a treadmill. So when I'm in a city, I went to Las Vegas and I chose to run outside and then I twisted my ankle, which made it impossible for me to run for the next week, right? And so there will always be, I could look back on the year and I could say, oh, when I went to Bolivia, I was on an airplane for 3 days, so there's no way I could have run. Or when I went to Las Vegas, I twisted my ankle, so that put me back. I could easily look at it in that way. Or I could say, somehow I was able to run a certain number of miles. And so I think the way that we choose to look at what we did matters. So I think that's the first thing I would say is look back looking for success. And not just take note of the successes, but take note of what contributed to those successes. What made those miles possible miles? The other thing I think that I would say about that process is look back at the lessons that you learned, right? So as you ran those miles, or even when you chose not to run, what got in the way? How then can you, again, use that knowledge? You still gained knowledge. How can you gain the knowledge of what got in your way to be more successful in the coming year? So again, I think you can either look at it as like I failed, or I gave into temptation, or I was just lazy, or you can choose to look at it as I now know more about myself than I did last year. So now what do I need to do to not fall into those traps again? Maybe I need an accountability partner. Maybe I need a tracker app, or maybe I need a reminder on my phone, or maybe I need to schedule just a routine. I do it at this time every day. Or I know now the failures oftentimes teach us more than the successes. If you were 100% successful at running, you may not have learned what made it possible for you to run. looking back at the knowledge that you have now, that's still progress. That's still going to prepare you. Again, if we look at it as like, this is the end, yes, but it's also the beginning of a new chapter. I'm walking into the beginning of a new chapter more equipped than I was last time I walked into a chapter.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. I really like that. There is a certain way to look back at this past chapter, and you can maintain that type of gaze, that type of filter in looking at, this past year, regardless of if you ran a marathon for the first time, or if all you were able to do was, run to the end of the street or something one time. There's a way to look at this past year that allows you to see what it is you need to see to gather kind of, here's what I was able to accomplish, here's what I need, useful information for, assessing yourself and going further into the next year. I also think that, what we have to keep in mind is that it's nearly impossible to be stuck in the same exact spot you were a year ago.
Yeah.
I'd like to think even on a micro level, we're different from day to day. I now know everything I didn't know about yesterday, and I'm that much more wiser or more aware than I was going into yesterday. So after 365 days, we have to be someone different. And this type of gaze that you're talking about is saying, here's how I look at that and see that I'm someone actually capable of stuff. I'm someone different in a good way, a useful way. I think that's inevitable. And that's something that helps get through difficult moments. Maybe you've had some low points in your year. But that's something you can absolutely say is, well, I got past that. Look how I'm in a different position. Look how I'm a different person now than I was then. And for you to even to feel badly about those moments in your year means that you've grown out of them. You're able to look past and say, I'm somewhere different now, or I am someone different now.
Yeah, you made me think of two things. And the first thing you made me think of is, like, again, take that example of me running and twisting my ankle, right? That at first, this tells you how much I really loathe running. At first, I was like, sweet, I don't have to run for like at least a week. And so I was kind of like, this gives me an excuse not to do this thing that I don't like. But one of the things that happened is that then I had to like get into a mindset of, so how do I recover from this? So for a little while, I did nothing, right? I just relaxed. I rested it. I put it up. I put ice on it, all of those kinds of things. And then I thought, okay, so I need to test it. So I'm just going to walk and I'm going to see how long I can walk. And then slowly over time, then I got back to running. And one of the things that I realized through that process is that I had learned that like a byproduct of running so often is that I had learned what my body could manage and what it couldn't. So before, if I had twisted my ankle, it would have been like, this is a great excuse to sit around and do nothing for the rest of the year because I don't know how to make this better. But because I knew my body so well, I knew when it hurt in a particular way, it was okay to keep going. But when it hurt in a different way, this is an unusual hurt that I didn't normally feel. So I better slow it down. I better stop doing this. And I learned from something that seemed like a setback, I actually then realized I had gained more knowledge than I even recognized that I had gained. And quickly, much quicker than I thought, I was back to running at the regular pace. And I remember shortly after twisting my ankle, I ran the equivalent of a 5K. And I thought, man, I used to think running a 5K was like an impossible task. And I just ran it after having a twisted ankle. And I think those moments where we think of as like failures or whatever, those might actually, again, kind of be markers of, man, I actually overcame more because of that setback. And now I feel even more accomplished than I thought that I could. So I think that was one thing that stood out to me. The other thing that stood out to me is kind of a gross thing, but you said there's no way that we could even be the same person. And I started thinking about like our fingernails completely grow out every 6 months, right? I think our toenails are a bit slower, which is disgusting. I hate feet, but like within a year, what you see as your toenails does not exist next year. Our skin is constantly renewing itself. Our hair, falls out and new hair grows back. And so we are a completely different physical version of ourselves at this moment in time than we were at this time last year. And I think if we kept that perspective of like, it's slow, almost imperceptible for us to recognize that change, but it means that we are completely different. And if we took that same perspective of like, I'm just slowly growing this ability, or I'm slowly growing this habit, or I'm slowly replacing this, it does become impossible for us to be the same.
Yeah, there's a potential pro and con to that gradualness as we move through the year, because we can become kind of uninfatuated with the moments that we're in. Whatever's going on, whatever we're doing, whatever is around, feels so typical to us that it's hard to be impressed with it. It's hard to maybe even be grateful for it. It's hard to see the meaning in those things. And that's where these kind of moments right now, when you're kind of ending a year, you're coming out of this segment of time where you can kind of look back over with a microscope and say, well, where were those meaningful things? Now, after having moved through all these moments, what are the things that I think I kind of overlooked in the moment because it was just a Tuesday to me, and what I was doing felt normal. That 5 miles I ran that morning felt totally typical to me. Whatever my fingernails were looking at the time that aren't my fingernails now. That kind of gradual change can be a bit blinding or at least numbing, I think, in the moment, because things are changing, but along the way, it always feels like you're in a normal circumstance. But when you look at it from a bit of a distance, it feels like you can really start to appreciate, well, no, that actually was really different. And I can tell the difference. January looked really different than October, and December most definitely is different than last December. I think that's another thing that this kind of a moment can really start to highlight for people.
Yeah, I think the last thing that I would say about this moment of reflection is that memory oftentimes isn't an accurate depiction. Just like we can think about and we can kind of conceptualize, we can create a future that we're hoping for. Oftentimes our history, our past, is dependent upon what's happening in a particular moment. And our memory is colored by that. If we're in a good mood, we tend to remember more positive aspects about the past. If we're in a bad mood, we tend to remember more negative aspects about the past. And one of the things that I would say then is there's something really meaningful about choosing when and how to reflect on 2022. It might also take some preparation to say, okay, I'm going to make this a really meaningful experience. What do I need to do so that I feel my best? What do I need? What do I want to go back and try to find, to look for, to remember and take note of? And I think if we are intentional about the actual moments of remembering, we will also influence what we remember and how we remember it. And so I think that's the thing too, is that we have an opportunity at these pivotal moments to create something really meaningful. And so I think as I come to the end of the year, I think that's maybe the encouragement or thoughts that I would give, is to say, be intentional about this particular moment and use that intentionality to make meaning of the past and to design a future that's consistent with what you want. There's some real power that you hold in how these events get captured.
I think that's a brilliant way to frame it, as this is a moment that there's potential power that you can really take advantage of and use to your benefit, and maybe even the benefit of people around you too. And so rather than just leaving on the table, be in all of our best interests to do that, to look at the year and the next year in that kind of way.
Yeah. So I guess as we end this season, I think just want to take a second and kind of look back and say, thank you for being along this journey with us. This season, I know this is season 3 of the podcast as a whole, but it's your first season, Cecil, with us. And thank you for making this season a meaningful season. Thank you to the people who listen, who send us feedback, who tell us about what they think about these topics. And I guess be anxious and anticipate another season that will come.
I'm looking forward to
it. Thanks, everybody.
This podcast is sponsored by the Solution Focused Universe, a global community dedicated to the growth of professionals who want to master the solution-focused approach. The SFU is home to the world's largest library of solution-focused material, which is updated on a monthly basis. Join fellow community members and solution-focused leaders in coaching calls and private Facebook groups to discuss anything and everything related to solution-focused brief therapy.